December 1944. A cut-off American company positioned near Bastogne, Belgium. Freezing fog blankets the dense forest as a lone radio operator hunches over a metal box, straining to hear through a wall of static. The line to battalion is dead, cut by advancing enemy armor hours ago, leaving 140 cold, exhausted soldiers completely isolated. Suddenly, a clear English voice cuts through the white noise on an official American military frequency, delivering a calm, devastating command. The voice claims to be Supreme Headquarters, ordering every surrounded unit in the sector to lay down their weapons and surrender immediately to the nearest German force. The company commander, broken by the isolation and pressure, reaches for his pistol belt, ready to walk his men into captivity. George Patton will respond to this invisible weapon not with standard military procedures, but with a swift, far-reaching decree that forces every soldier in his command to look past the voice and look at the truth. This is the story of how a single radio operator exposed a German psychological operation and prevented a mass surrender in the frozen forests of Belgium. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what soldiers found that changed them forever, uncovering the hidden truths behind the front lines. Technician 4th grade Stanley Park was a 23-year-old from Portland, Oregon, serving as a company radio operator in the Ardennes. Before the war, he had spent his teenage years in a cramped attic tinkering with vacuum tubes and copper wires, operating his own amateur ham radio under the call sign W7SPK. That pre-war hobby taught him how to listen to the subtle physics of the airwaves, recognizing the unique hum of specific transmitters and the precise rhythm of professional military signaling. He had survived the grueling march across France, losing his best friend to an artillery barrage outside Metz, a loss that left him quiet and hyper-vigilant. Now, shivering in a frozen ditch near Bastogne, his hands gripped a frozen radio set as he stared at his hesitant captain. The entire weight of the company rested on his ability to decipher a single, suspicious transmission coming through his headphones. Operating the mobile broadcast equipment on the opposite side of the tree line was Captain Hans Dieter Werner, a 28-year-old intelligence officer from Berlin. Werner was a man of immense unearned privilege, wearing a pristine, custom-tailored winter overcoat and polished leather boots that had never seen the inside of a muddy trench. He had spent 3 years studying literature at an elite American university before the war, a luxury bought by his family's deep political connections in the German capital. Werner viewed psychological operations not as warfare, but as an intellectual chess match against an inferior enemy. He stood inside a heated communication van, holding captured American signal logs and interrogation reports with a smug smile. He firmly believed that the exhausted Americans lacked the mental discipline to question an official command, especially when delivered in his flawless, unblemished English. He keyed the microphone, confident his linguistic trickery would easily capture an entire company without firing a single bullet. The middle of December 1944 brought the freezing weight of the German winter counteroffensive crashing through the densely forested hills of the Ardennes. The unexpected assault caught Allied forces completely by surprise, shattering thin defensive lines and plunging the entire front into absolute chaos. Divisions were fractured into small, isolated pockets as rapid armored columns severed communication wires and overran vital supply hubs. In the swirling snow and thick ground fog, senior commanders at headquarters struggled to map the fluid battlefield, frequently losing track of entire regiments for days at a time. This pervasive lack of reliable information created a dangerous vacuum where rumor and panic could spread faster than enemy fire. Junior officers on the front lines were suddenly forced to make life-or-death tactical decisions, with zero guidance from their superior battalions. In this environment of total isolation, psychological warfare became a lethal weapon utilized with terrifying precision by the retreating enemy. German high command realized that a well-placed lie could dismantle a defensive perimeter far more effectively than an artillery barrage. Special intelligence units equipped with mobile transmitters moved parallel to the advancing tanks, constantly scanning American frequencies to exploit the confusion. Many higher-ranking Allied officers had previously dismissed these rogue enemy broadcasts as minor nuisances or crude attempts at intimidation that required no formal countermeasures. They chose to ignore the growing threat, leaving individual company commanders to decipher which radio messages were genuine and which were deadly fabrications. This systemic negligence allowed enemy operators to infiltrate the airwaves completely unchecked, directly leading to the perilous situation developing in the frozen woods outside Bastogne. The company commander stared at the small green radio unit, his hand shaking as the voice through the headphones repeated the command. He looked up at his frozen platoon leaders and said, "We are completely cut off, and the Supreme Headquarters is telling us to surrender." Park pulled his headset off one ear and said, "Sir, do not sign that order, because that radio broadcast is an absolute fake." The captain glared at him and said the operator on the line just used our correct battalion call sign and gave the exact name of our regiment. Park shook his head and said the tactical protocol is entirely wrong for a division-level message, and the frequency allocation does not match our morning signal sheet. The captain stepped closer into the muddy trench and said, "We have been without food or ammunition for 2 days, and I am not going to let 140 men get slaughtered because you think you hear something strange in the static." Park held his ground and said the man speaking just called for the position of the lieutenant, but he pronounced the word exactly like a German officer trying to sound like a British broadcaster. The captain reached for the master microphone switch and said, "That is a standard military relay, and we are laying down our weapons before the next mortar barrage starts." Park grabbed the captain by the sleeve and said, "If you key that radio transmitter and reveal our grid coordinates, they will not capture us. They will zero their artillery directly onto this ditch." The captain paused, with his finger on the black toggle switch, looking at the young technician, who was staring back at him with absolute certainty. The captain slowly pulled his hand away from the radio panel and said, "You better be right about that accent, son, because if you are wrong, we are all dead men by midnight." Park turned the tuning dial back to the primary command frequency, logged the exact time of the fraudulent transmission, and began typing a flash report in standard Morse code. He tapped the brass key repeatedly, sending the warning through the atmospheric interference toward any receiving station in the 3rd Army sector. The urgent signal was intercepted by a mobile intercept vehicle operating 10 miles to the south, and the written report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the mobile communication outpost within the hour. 4 stars gleamed on his polished helmet, and his ivory-handled revolvers rested firmly on his belt. The general walked in unannounced, his presence instantly silencing the hum of the busy tactical command center. Officers and operators frozen at their stations, as Patton stepped toward the desk where the intercepted radio logs were laid out. He studied the transcribed messages for a few quiet moments, his face completely unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice surprisingly quiet, but carrying a cold weight that cut through the remaining tension in the room. "Bring that German captain inside immediately," Patton said. Werner walked in, his tailored overcoat immaculate, his head held high with a look of educated defiance. Patton looked at him and said, "You are the officer responsible for broadcasting these surrender instructions on our tactical networks." Werner smiled faintly and said, "I was merely conducting a standard psychological operation using available logistical data." Patton looked closer at the logbook and said, "You used captured American signal files to impersonate the Supreme Allied Headquarters." Werner nodded and said, "Warfare is an exercise in deception, and your men were foolish enough to listen to an official frequency." Patton tilted his head slightly and said, "You believed your perfect English vocabulary would cause 140 soldiers to abandon their defensive line without a fight." Werner crossed his arms and said, "Your soldiers are soft and easily panicked when they find themselves isolated in the dark. You believe you are playing an intellectual game of chess from the safety of a heated radio van," Patton said. You stand there in your unsoiled boots and your custom coat, thinking your university degree gives you the right to trick desperate men into captivity. But you forgot that a real soldier does not just listen to the words being spoken on a wire. A real soldier knows the exact rhythm of his brothers in arms and can spot an imposter by the slight slip of a single foreign tongue. Technician Park was shivering in a freezing ditch while you sat by a stove. Yet his disciplined ears defeated your entire expensive broadcast apparatus in less than 5 minutes. You tried to use our own communication channels to steal an entire company from the field of battle. Now you will learn what happens when your invisible weapons are turned directly back against your own network. You have exactly 2 options in front of you right now. You will either sit at that radio key and broadcast a complete retraction to your own advancing lines, or you will face the immediate physical consequence of your electronic treachery. Decide your course in the next 10 seconds. Werner looked at the general's cold eyes, and his hand began to drift down toward his side. Patton called for the immediate assembly of every radio operator, intelligence clerk, and signal officer currently stationed within a 5-mile radius of the division command post. Werner was marched out into the freezing courtyard under heavy guard, his hands bound tightly behind his back with telephone wire. The afternoon sun broke weakly through the gray clouds, illuminating a bank of loudspeakers that had been stripped from a captured German propaganda truck and wired directly into the American signal network. A communications sergeant stepped forward and forced a heavy hand-cranked military microphone into Werner's restrained fingers, ensuring the device was securely locked in the open broadcast position. The surrounding crowd of soldiers stood in absolute silence as the transmission hummed to life, their breath fogging in the bitter winter air. Werner looked up at the wall of hostile faces, his throat tightening, as he realized that his voice was about to carry across the entire front line. He began to read from the typed retraction, his perfect English trembling slightly as he admitted to his own deliberate deception over the open airwaves. Every American unit in the sector listened to the broadcast, their initial confusion dissolving into grim satisfaction as they heard the arrogant voice completely break under the pressure of its own public exposure. Stanley Park returned home to Portland after the cessation of hostilities, where he quietly re-established his amateur radio license and built a brand new shortwave transmitter in his basement. He married a local schoolteacher in 1948 and spent 30 years working as a senior electrical technician for the regional power company, never speaking to his children about the freezing woods of Belgium, unless someone specifically asked about the small, bronze star medal kept inside his top dresser drawer. He died peacefully at his home in 1991, remembered by his neighborhood friends simply as a skilled handyman who could fix any broken wire or receiver in the town. Hans-Dieter Werner was sent to a secure military prison camp in England before being repatriated to a devastated Berlin in the winter of 1947. The elite university connections of his pre-war life had completely vanished along with the old political hierarchy, leaving him to spend his remaining decades working as a low-level clerk in a municipal transit office. He lived out his life in a cramped concrete apartment, harboring a quiet, bitter resentment toward the mechanical precision of modern communication networks until his death in 1983. General George Patton kept the formal signal report from the Bastogne incident locked inside his personal field desk for the remainder of the European campaign, referring to the tactical radio interception only once during a private staff dinner in late January. He noted to his senior officers that the most dangerous weapon the enemy possessed was not a heavier tank or a larger artillery piece, but a well-spoken lie delivered directly into the ear of a frightened commander who had lost his connection to the chain of command. Some military historians have argued that Patton's immediate public exposure of the deceptive broadcast was an unnecessary distraction during a critical phase of the Ardennes counteroffensive, suggesting that the general should have left psychological warfare matters to specialized intelligence departments at Army headquarters. These critics believe that using valuable operational time to stage a public retraction risked compromising local communication security protocols. Conversely, other historians have argued that Patton's decisive intervention was a brilliant tactical masterstroke that instantly neutralized a dangerous enemy weapon, preventing widespread panic across multiple isolated sectors. What is certain is that after the Bastogne radio incident, the Third Army Chain of Command issued strict new verification procedures, ensuring that no further fraudulent surrender orders ever disrupted the American lines. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have publicly humiliated the enemy broadcaster to send a warning, or would you have quietly turned him over to intelligence officers for standard interrogation? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what soldiers found that changed them forever, make sure to subscribe.